And now it's my honor to introduce to you the geographer of the United States, Dr. Lee Schwartz.
Thank you, John, and good morning, everyone. I have the pleasure today of introducing this year's keynote speaker, Parag Khanna. You all have gotten copies of his book, Connectography, in your Geography 2050 registration bags, and have had an opportunity to read his bio listing his very many accomplishments and publications. And I also assume many of you probably are aware of Parag's insights through his TED Talks, his radio interviews, his podcasts, his op-eds, or his tweets. But who really is Parag Khanna? I know him as a critical thinker of some of the world's wicked problems, a prolific author, a global traveler, a teacher, and a fellow Columbia University alumnus. He is, quite frankly, more than a mere Renaissance man. He is, I believe, Superman. And I have compiled some evidence of his superpowers. He has the omnipresence to send simultaneous tweets from several of the world's regions at the same time. He has the ability to explode the laws of physics so as to disrupt all natural linkages between time and space. He creates sustainable urban systems out of cities that are inherently unsustainable. And perhaps most remarkably, he has proven beyond a doubt that an international affairs major actually can understand spatial relations. What Parag is not, however, is a geographer. Or at least he was not a geographer until his Connectography book launch in New York City in April of 2016, when I used my authority as a U.S. geographer to confer upon Parag the status of honorary geographer with this diploma, which reads as follows. In recognition of his outstanding contribution to raising geographic literacy and awareness worldwide, from debunking theories of sovereignty to destroying concepts of space to devaluing the salience of international borders, the Office of the Geographer on Global Issues hereby proclaims that Parag Khanna should henceforth and forevermore be recognized as possessor of the title Honorary Geographer, done this day, April 21, 2016. So I welcome Parag again today to our discipline. I don't want to take up too much more of Parag's time, but I do have one recent and very brief anecdote to offer that speaks to the power of his message. About a month ago, I went down to Charlottesville, Virginia, to the University of Virginia, to give a guest lecture in a course that was being taught by the former Deputy Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State, Andy Reynolds. It was a graduate course in the UVA Engineering School, which is part of that university's STEM curriculum, and the title of the course was Science, Engineering, and Technology for National Security and Leadership. Andy devoted 1 week of his course to geography, which is when he asked me to speak, and the only reading he assigned was Parag's book, Connectography. That, to me, speaks volumes to the wide-ranging applicability of what Parag has to say, not just about evolving space and time relations that guide the future of mobility, but also about the importance of integrating geography with issues such as science and technology, education, finance, governorship, and security. And it is Parag's ability to contextualize the broad range of these topics through a lens into the future that allows me to call him my favorite geographer. So please join me in welcoming Parag.
Thank you. That was awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Well, Lee, you're my favorite geographer. Can you just stay up here and carry on? Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much. That was really the best introduction ever. We're a good double act by now. I've been here since yesterday, and it's been really a privilege to listen in on the conversations and to talk to so many of you, which is why backstage just now I was trying to cut some slides from the presentation. So, because I'm standing between you and our continuing this conversation, which has been so fruitful and engaging. So I'm going to try and race through. But first, before that, but Lee, again, thank you so much. To John, to Marie, to Chris, I'm really honored to be associated with AGS. It really is a privilege. I'm learning so much from the experience. And this is a great opportunity not just to talk about trends, to contribute to the discussions that we've been having about global trends, but also, of course, to bring it back to the pedagogical angle, because it means so much to all of us. And I'm just delighted to hear all the stories and feedback that you have about the way in which the book and talks and so forth are stimulating conversation within the classroom, and I really want to, that really motivates me to keep on going. So let me, though, really power through this as quickly as possible so that we can jump back into the discussion. And I want to sort of structure it in this way, kind of looking at the global, regional, local scales, impact of connectivity on geopolitical issues, certainly on human migration, human demographics, human geography, such a key feature in all of your curricula. And of course, what it means, again, for the students and for the next generation, which is really, of course, who all of you are here for, who I try to write for. Ever since my first book, this Connectography was the kind of completion of a trilogy. But it's always been about trying to write the book that I wish that I had been assigned freshman year in college, or had there been AP Human Geography, or at least in my school when I was growing up, that's the book I would have wanted to have. And I'm still always writing that book in a way. It's just one long stream of consciousness trying to address that me from from the ages of sort of between 17 and 22. So I'm going to keep on doing that, and your input is very valuable. So my point of departure for this book is really just the simple question of what have we built? What is it that is lasting over time? Is it states and boundaries, or is it infrastructures? And so I went back to some of the analysis, some of the history, some of the finest traditions in thinking about geography that come actually from the military, particularly the United States military. And the terminology that I discovered, because indeed I'm not a geographer, as Lee pointed out, at least I wasn't until I was conferred that title upon me, but is this term topographical engineering. Topographical engineering, the term that the Army uses and that militaries around the world use to describe the ways in which they need to build certain infrastructures to enable operations. And those infrastructures have a longevity. And when you look over thousands of years of history and you look at all of the infrastructures we have built, you come up with a map like this. And this shows you all of the world's highways and railways, as well as the energy systems, the oil and gas pipelines, electricity grids, internet cables, satellite data. And I liken this, especially if you plot this as a sort of time series going back hundreds of years, to the building of an exoskeleton, the Earth being something like a human body, and us building these skeletal, vascular, and nervous systems in a way that enable the mobility of people, of resources, of goods, ideas, and so forth all around the world. And that is really what we've been doing. And sure, we have built lots of political boundaries. Political geography is extremely important. It's central. We actually have more states in the world than we have had well, perhaps ever. But at the same time, we have a lot more connectivity, a lot more physical infrastructure across those boundaries than ever before. And the gap is growing tremendously. And so that's the intersection that I've sought to explore. It's not about one geography subsuming another geography. It's about the interplay of the different geographies, specifically the natural, the political, and the functional. Now, we don't really have many disputes about how to depict natural geography, right? We use the color blue for the oceans, brown for the deserts, green for the forests. Not a whole lot of argument. We know we have to modify those maps because of climate change, desertification, and other phenomenon, but we generally respect natural geography. But political geography is the form that to me, what motivates me so much is the fact that from the time we're born till the time we die, in 99% of all the world's offices and classrooms, the first map that kids see, and the map that really defines the way we think about the world, is the political geography. So we're raised from birth to just assume that it's natural to divide ourselves up through political boundaries. But in a way, it's of course not as natural as the Earth, such as it is, that we inherit. And in a way, the fact that we have been building such robust infrastructures of connectivity over centuries and are building more and more, doesn't that speak at some level to our innate desire, to our impulses, if you will? And so to me, we are, in a way, we think that we are inherently tribal people, that political geography is evidence of that, that more secessionist movements and tribal movements are evidence of our sort of deeply sectarian nature. But at the same time, how do you reconcile that with the fact that we immediately, with whatever engineering, technological capabilities we have at any age, in any time in history, and certainly today, we use it immediately to connect. We immediately are reaching out. We're immediately building bridges across those boundaries. So what is it that is more fundamentally human? And to me, that is really, in a way, a simple question, but a very profound question that leads us in a very different direction from where just simply focusing and assuming that political geography is the most natural, in a way, thing to be teaching kids should really be called into question. So to me, the arc of history, literally with a capital H, really does bend towards ever more connectivity, because in every age, that's what we seem to be investing a lot more in. And we've certainly reached or crossed a tipping point, if you will, where connectivity is overwhelming, is superseding the divisions in the world. And that's causing, obviously, a lot of complexity. Things can come out two-dimensionally and static in print, like the maps that are in the book, but I've been working and experimenting with a number of partners online to try and map out infrastructures, because they're obviously constantly being laid down, and you can't always print that in a book. So one of the efforts is with the Center for Geographical Analysis at Harvard, where we've been keeping track of various databases, new railway projects, high-speed rails, pipelines, internet cables as they get laid down. And we put them in here. And when I use this with governments, for example, or other communities, you can zoom in, toggle around, you can switch on and off certain infrastructures, and you can use it to say, what is our connectivity gap where we are? What do we want to invest in? And what are the places, not our own geography if we have a connectivity gap, but what are the adjacent geographies? Who can be our partners in connectivity? And this, I find, is a very useful thought exercise. So these are on my website. We've got this, and together with Mapbox as well, another online mapping data set, which I think of as really tools that one can use to start to think about, to zoom into one's own geography and think about how to enhance it through connectivity. Okay, so I'm very bad at making PowerPoint slides, and I don't know how to do this sort of like sequencing thing where you hide something and then you only bring it up later on. So before I bring up the next slide, which has the answer to the quiz I wanted to have right now at the top, let me ask you, the background to this question, this is going to be the only quiz of the day, I think, unless you quiz me, we've had the last couple of years of very obviously visceral debates in our political cycle in the presidential election, and there was clearly, migration was one of the major issues, right? And should we have a wall, for example, on the Mexican border and so forth. So it occurred to me that in reflecting on the election and all of the debates, that no one actually seemed to point out, at least not in the mainstream media, how many people actually do cross the US-Mexico border every year. How many people do cross the US-Canadian border every year? So I thought I would ask that as a quiz. And now, given the pedigree, the experience, the knowledge, and the subject matter that we're all immersed in, I'm assuming that someone's going to get the answer right away or already knows it. But bearing in mind, again, did you hear in the last 2 years on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, did you hear anyone say, let's not just talk about the couple of thousand or whatever number of illegal border crossings, but rather the bigger picture, right? So I'm asking about the bigger picture. How many people legally cross the US-Canadian border every year and the US-Mexican border? Let's start with US-Canada border. Any guesses? How many legal, legitimate?
35.
Good guess. Okay, 50. How about now the US-Mexican border? 50 million? Do I hear? No. Good guess. It's interesting, right? Because we've been obsessed, or at least our political class and our debates were hijacked by this issue of illegal immigration, couple thousand, whatever number people, right? But again, losing the forest for the trees. So here are the figures. 50 million US-Canada crossings, 35 million US-Mexico crossings every single year. These are the two busiest borders on the planet Earth. I find it hard to believe, Lee, correct me if I'm wrong, can you imagine anytime soon any pair of countries having more, again, annual, legal, registered border crossings, right? So we are actually in a very propitious geography, a very stable mega continent of North America. Other countries would be very lucky to have neighbors like ours. But for the lack of this general knowledge, this basic factual knowledge about how beneficial the bilateral exchange of people, of migration, mobility across these two borders, we've allowed our conversation to be obviously dumbed down, skewed, hijacked in a very negative direction. But these are the facts, right? This is voluntary migration. This is in many ways mutually enriching. And this is one of the maps from the book. And the reason I put it up is, of course, because if you don't map the connectivity, you won't appreciate the connectivity, right? If you still try to explain to people the value of migration, of mobility, of infrastructure, of sharing utilities and resources, of exchanges in energy and water and food, but you don't map it out, you leave people to just imagine it, right? But why don't we actually, because seeing is believing, right? Why don't we actually put it on the map? And that's what I think is so important to do. So if you actually map out the infrastructures of the electricity grids, for example, the highways, the railways, the pipelines between Canada, the US, Mexico, you get a much better sense of how deeply integrated North America is. And you wouldn't come to believe that things like NAFTA can be switched on and off, right, like a light. Because that's not the way connectivity operates. Because again, those infrastructures have an incredible durability, a utility, a mutual benefit that it can be quantified, but in many ways has these second order effects that are difficult to quantify. So it's one of the things that I've been looking at is how, if you look particularly at the energy sector and the growth in energy trade across North America, how beneficial that is, new pipelines that are under development, and so forth. And you can also see that if you look at the supply chain relationships between pairs of cities within North America. You can look at the trade between Mexico City and Los Angeles, or between Seattle and Vancouver, or Chicago and Toronto, and so forth, and you get a sense of just how integrated, in fact, we are. So I wanted to bring this back to this sort of set of this sort of typology of geographies: political geography, natural geography, functional geography. There's also administrative geography within that, and that's both domestic and international. How do we define the boundaries? Now, we've talked a lot about cities, for example, and in the cities discourse, we differentiate between a city's core population, metropolitan regions, whether it's the World Bank or the academic community. We're wrestling with redefining, right, the geographic parameters of the city in order to measure demographics and economic value. And you can use data like that to rethink the administrative geography of a country, such as our own. So some of you may have seen this. This is the map that was produced by Dartmouth University when they started to take data around commuter patterns, credit card transactions, and I think mobile phone data. And they could sort of map out what is the sort of functional gravity that governs the the sort of transactions of 300 million Americans. And this is what they came up with. And what it kind of shows is that rather than think of the country as 50 administrative states, political states, it's more like these 40 urban clusters, right? Everyone has some degree of bond, strong or loose, to one of these 40 geographic clusters. And you could rethink, and this is why I call it sort of spheres of responsibility, you could rethink these broader city environments and the people who relate to them and depend on them as a sphere of responsibility of that city. And thinking in terms, purely in terms of states, the way we do, the way we have, of course, since the 18th century, is not necessarily the most useful way to think about how you're administering, organizing, optimizing, structuring the economy, and even the politics of the United States. And that's something that we're struggling with right now, obviously, as we look at how to do districting and redistricting for elections and that sort of thing. And other countries are grappling with this as well. It's just that they seem to be seizing the reins a lot faster. If you look at what they're doing in China, for example, sure, China has 30 provinces. Many of them are ethnically, linguistically, historically defined, quite rooted. And they have a 5,000-year-old civilization. And despite being a 5,000-year-old civilization, they're still able to say, you know what, we need to actually merge certain administrative units and clusters, have them govern themselves together, pool their budgets, build infrastructure across the short geographies between them, and become these viable economic clusters, right? They can make that happen within and across provincial boundaries. Now, if they can do that despite having quite heterogeneous sort of histories, ethnically, linguistically, and so forth, surely we can do that, right? But yet we can't. And I think that that barrier between moving from the legacies of political geography to the reality of functional geography is obviously holding us back in a big way. And other countries I see in Europe, for example, this is front and center in the politics of Italy, France, and in the UK. How do you transition towards a more viable state, a more effective country, by way of getting cities or municipalities to cooperate more together? And our success, I think, hinges on that as well. And in doing so, in thinking about metropolitan agglomerations that have a certain minimal viable population size so that you can have a thriving services economy is very, very critical. And then, of course, within those to enable greater, more efficient mobility. The wage to housing ratio is very critical. If you think about if we had wider highways, high-speed rail in certain corridors, people could live in areas where the cost of living is lower but commute efficiently to places where they earn higher wages and therefore be able to save more of their income, for example, right? Rather than feeling like they're stranded in certain more isolated, less connected geographies. So there's an immense value to thinking in terms of how do you cluster people more effectively, incentivize them to do so, but create connectivity within those clusters. And we're a long way from getting that right. Now let me go to the global level again and talk about, again, this sort of discrepancy between what we think of when we focus only on political geography and the reality of the shift towards functional geography. And I use Africa, which is a obvious great case study to use because it has the most countries of any continent. And we focus a lot on the political divisions, the continuous search, in a way, to settle political boundaries and disputes in the vast post-colonial sort of realm. So here on the left, I've mapped out some of the independence or secessionist movements in Africa. But what I think is more interesting is this map on the right, because it shows you the growing intensity of the railway infrastructure, of the electricity grids, pipelines, and other sorts of projects that are particularly happening around East Africa. And some people call this the Benelux, right? You're familiar with the core 6 European countries that came together to form the coal and steel community that eventually became the European Union. People are starting to refer to the East African countries as the Benelux of East Africa because they are realizing that in a world of 200 countries, to be small, isolated, landlocked, poor, and weak is not exactly how you get on the map, attract investment, and participate in the global economy and global supply chains. Instead, you have to aggregate together, and you can't aggregate just by talking about it. You have to build that connectivity. And so a lot of, for example, Chinese investment in Africa is being steered in this direction, not just towards the extractive industry, though that's important as well, but into the infrastructures that help people be more mobile, be more economic agents. And that then enables a sort of mobility across the continent. One of the things that at last year's summit of all African heads of state, they agreed to was to try to push towards a visa-free continent by the year 2020. They may not get there by 2020, they may not get there by 2025, but the fact is that they're moving in that direction, and it's a very, very positive sign. So the infrastructural investments combined with the sort of legal and diplomatic reforms give you a very different picture of where parts of Africa may be going than just looking at the political map. The role model, the gold standard for all of this is Europe. And one of the ironies of today's pessimism or Euro-pessimism is that around the world, whether it's Africa, Southeast Asia, regions are saying, how can we be more like Europe, right? Not necessarily how can we have a single currency, which is proven to be a mixed blessing, but how can we at least get to a situation where we're optimizing our, if we're optimizing beyond our political geography, right? Europe, too, is fragmented into many countries. But if you look at just their energy and transportation system, right? This is actually just the oil and gas pipelines. It would be indecipherable if I were to put up, obviously, the highways and the rail networks in Europe, right? As dense as they are. And you have a situation where just taking Europe's energy supply, where you can't even necessarily decipher the, you can't have an internally or autarkic, national energy system in Europe. What you have instead is that the grids are getting more and more seamlessly merged together. When, after the Fukushima nuclear incident in 2011, when the German government said that it wanted to shift and phase out nuclear power, it actually winds up importing nuclear power from France. So even if a country in Europe wants to go non-nuclear, it can't go non-nuclear. Such is the extent to which Europe is an egg that can't be unscrambled. And the European process of integration has had very significant, demographic implications. The EU did commission a study a couple of years ago about the implications of the Erasmus generation. Erasmus is the program that allows students to spend 1 or more years of their university term in another EU member state, and they calculated that there's already been about 1 million Erasmus babies that have been born. In other words, children born of parents from 2 different EU member states simply as a result of that Erasmus program. Now that's very critical if you want to eventually bring about a common European identity. Again, you can issue lots of statements in Brussels about the need for collaboration between governments and coordination of foreign policy, but that's not actually going to make it happen, right, until you enable more mobility, more cross-cultural communication, and so forth. So I actually, despite Brexit and a lot of the nationalism that we see in individual European countries' politics, I'm fairly optimistic that because of things like Erasmus, plus energy, plus the free mobility that Europeans still enjoy, that you'll continue to have this process. Let me take what I think is, I confidently believe this is the sort of biggest story of the 21st century. It is the bringing together across East and West of Eurasia, between Europe and Asia, this construction of the new Belt and Road initiative, the new Silk Roads, the transportation networks that are really bringing together 2 of the world's largest population centers. Don't forget that the European Union as a whole has a population of more than 600 million people, so larger population than North America. And of course, here on this map, you have more than 50% of the world population, right? You've got more than 4.5 billion people living right here, mostly within just this sort of circle of East Asia. And since the fall of the Berlin Wall 28 years ago, collapse of the Soviet Union, quarter century ago, you've had Europe expanding to the east through all of its infrastructure investments, all of the railways and modernization and bringing countries into the EU and NATO. And you also had, and again, we were so focused on what has been going on in Western civilization, we weren't paying as much attention to the fact that China and other Asian countries didn't waste that much time either in the 1990s in terms of figuring out how they were going to take advantage of the fact that the Cold War had ended, Soviet Union collapsed. You have this map full of, again, poor, post-colonial, post-Soviet countries that have been quite neglected economically, infrastructurally. Billions of people, again, especially if you take Africa and South Asia, you've got populations that have tripled pretty much since decolonization, since the 1940s. So an enormous need for infrastructure investment to create jobs and to get economies, get societies connected. And so what's happening, particularly now, since 2014, with the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank being announced, is that looking forward, you have not just the hundreds of billions of dollars that have already been spent, but now trillions of dollars that are being pledged, that are being invested into the high-speed rail networks, pipelines, and so forth that are really going to bring together Eurasia into one much more integrated commercial sort of system. You already have railways that carry goods from China, like laptops, mobile phones, and so forth, from coastal China through Kazakhstan, Russia, all the way to Germany, that take about 12 to 13 days, which is less than half the time that it takes to ship goods via the Indian Ocean and the Suez Canal. And you've got 20 trains that are operating weekly. That's set to grow to about 50 in the next couple of years. And there's a very brisk trade that's going back and forth. Europeans are certainly benefiting from shipping goods in the other direction over to these thriving, growing Asian markets. So the reason I wanted to show you this is because, it's been an article of faith, or just a sort of, an assumption that since in the entire post-Cold War, rather in the post-war economic system, the strongest trade and investment relationship in the world has been that between the United States and the European Union. The transatlantic economy has been the largest trading zone, largest free trade zone in the world. And it's reached about $1 trillion plus, just about 1.1 or so trillion dollars a year in annual exchange in goods and services, which is very, very significant. But if you look at, again, this geography, bridging Europe and Asia, what you have already is that if you take Europe's trade with China, Europe's trade with Southeast Asia, Europe's trade with Japan, with India, you can throw in South Korea as well, you already get more than that, right? Europe already trades more with Asia than it does with America. So that, again, that article of faith that the strongest, that the anchor really of the world economy and of the world's sort of free trading system is the Western Alliance, certainly true that it is an anchor of one of the anchors, but it's not the only one. And in terms of the volume of trade, Eurasia, cross-Eurasian trade is now greater than transatlantic trade. And you can, whether you're seeing goods shipped by train or whether by ship, it adds up to a lot more than 1 trillion. And the growth rate is staggering. And this is despite the fact that whereas we have pretty much free trade across the Atlantic, Europe barely has any free trade agreements with Asia. And the infrastructure still isn't even that good. So the two biggest obstacles have yet to be overcome between Europe and Asia, and already they're trading more with each other than either of them is trading with us. So just imagine if we come back in 10 years, you're going to see trans-Eurasian trade be anywhere from, economists say, $2.5 to $3 trillion, whereas given the slow economic growth that we have and Europe has, that may not have grown that much at all. So the center of gravity, because of the connectivity, is shifting very, very tremendously towards this other part of the world. What's also significant to me in terms of the impact of connectivity on geopolitics is the fact that we are genuinely in a new landscape, a new playing field where every region of the world actually matters in the conversation. If you think about the share of world GDP and world production that was represented by just the OECD countries around the end of the Cold War, it was like 80%, right? But now you see a much more distributed economic picture in terms of distribution of GDP value, of obviously industrial output, and so forth. It's all very, very distributed. And to have a truly global, not just a global strategy for companies or for governments, but even global thinking, you could get away in the past with just focusing on the trends, the dynamics in North America and Europe and a little bit of Asia. But today, we have to appreciate that we've never lived in a landscape before where every region, every continent was simultaneously involved in these transactions and building its own connectivity with each other. So you can see more economic ties, more trade relationships, more nonstop flights, whatever the case may be, between any two regions in the world. And the growth rates in trade, using Europe and Asia as just one example, but using Asia and Africa, you see even more astounding growth, something on the order of 2,000% growth in trade between Asia and Africa between 2002 and 2014, right? 2,000%. It was starting from a low base, but now Asia trades far more with Africa than North America does, and it's catching up very close, catching up to Europe, and Europe is much closer to Africa, right? And yet still, that gravity is so strong. So I see the world taking on this kind of spider web structure, if you will, in which there isn't necessarily one power at the center dictating who gets to connect to whom, who forges a trade, investment, even strategic and military ties with whom, where we see a kind of flourishing in all directions. Now, let me focus on, again, because our theme is mobility, that means people. So another major deficit in the traditional maps, the conventional maps that we use and teach, is that they don't show people. And yet, of course, you can do that. So here we have every human being in the world. All 7.8 billion of us are a pixel here on this map. So you can clearly see, as I was mentioning earlier, the demographic shift towards cities, or towards Asia. And I've layered in these ovals that show you the kind of mega cities that are the central economic geographies, really where you're seeing urbanization, infrastructure investment, economic growth coming together is really these ovals. And those represent a very large share of national and even regional GDPs. So it sort of begs the question, when you think about the world from the standpoint of which geographies matter demographically, economically, and even to some degree politically, does the political map tell you that reality, or does a map that kind of just highlights these 50 key megacity clusters tell you more? And the argument, again, is actually not either or, it's both, right? But it's that if you didn't show the demographics, if you didn't show those megacities and just how valuable and what a driving force they are in political decision making, you wouldn't necessarily understand where the world is going. I want to, so for example, the way I see it, when you look at the world from the standpoint of cities, right, rather than countries, what it leads you to realize is that you couldn't go to a city in the world and not meet people who were pro-connectivity, who were pro-trade. Let's say if you're an economist and you're trying to quantify the GDP of, say, New York City, how would you strip out the economy of New York that doesn't have something to do with connectivity, right? That doesn't require international trade, that doesn't require the business travelers and the students coming in and the logistics and the airport and goods coming from abroad. What would be the GDP of New York, right? Of the 500 billion that the GDP is, what would it be without this connectivity? And yet you would not really be able to figure that out. It's too complicated. You can't do it for New York, you can't do it for London, you can't do it for Dubai or Singapore. And it's so inherent, it's so ingrained in the way cities think that that is a natural state of affairs. They're always seeking greater and greater connectivity. And when I look at the sort of foreign policy of cities, I find that cities don't see the rise of a new city as a competitor the way we would often write about it in the media. We'd say something like, Hong Kong and Shanghai are rivals, or Hong Kong and Singapore are rivals. Or the fact is that each actually views the other as an opportunity for growth. They want to trade more with each other, they want to have more flight connections to each other, they want to connect their stock exchanges to each other. And that's part of the logic, if you will, of a city-centric world that we're increasingly moving towards. Certainly the movement of people underscores this. Again, a lot of talk about borders going up, walls going up, Brexit, and so on. The reality, of course, is that we have more migrants, more expats, more people living outside their country of origin than ever in history. By some estimates, that's reaching close to 300 million people. It's everything from professionals in finance or athletes and doctors, and teachers, to of course construction workers and maids and so forth. But and refugees as well. But if you add it all up, it's a growing number of people who are crossing boundaries. And what I find that's so interesting is that part of the reason we get this conversation or this trend wrong is because, again, from the standpoint of our own national political lens, our own politics, or the UK, you would get this sense that migration is grinding to a halt. But most human migration, of course, is not from them to us, right? It's between them. right? In other words, it's within Africa, it's across the post-colonial countries, it's from South Asia to the Middle East and so forth. And that's going to continue. I just mentioned African countries wanting to be visa-free. The whole Southeast Asian region, 750 million people, is going visa-free. More and more countries are saying we want to have a visa on arrival. We want to have entrepreneur visas, giving out 5-year visas to anyone who pledges to start a company. That's the reality of migration policy in the world today. It's not building a fence on border between 2 Eastern European countries to block Syrian refugees. That's one very, very small example. Not even Brexit is an insignificant blip, literally an insignificant blip in the grand story of the growth in human cross-border migration today. So I'm actually going to stop right there, and the sign just went up saying stop. So I hope that there's still plenty of time for a dialogue. But thank you again for having me here today. Really look forward to the conversation. Thank you. Thank you. So, fire away.
I'm Denny Adams. I'm a faux geographer, and I'd like to ask an unrelated question. Would you say a few words about the issues of fresh water and war and the cost of desalination as a drag on both connectivity and the GDP of the world?
Sure. I think that's a great question. And water is one of these resources that's thus far been less fungible, right, than other commodities for which we've developed very complex global supply chains and the infrastructure to back them up. And for example, if you just compare it to LNG, liquefied natural gas used to be a very regional market, and now we have tankers that have made LNG a totally global market, and that's reducing the price of gas. If you could do something so easily for large quantities of water across countries, you could actually perhaps stimulate or not have the constraint on social development and economic growth that water constraint does in fact have. So I think it's actually a great question. If you look at it from a couple of ways. There's obviously the places where just significant water shortages, falling water tables combined with desertification is having a very devastating impact on agriculture and creating sort of unintended migration schemes in the dry belt countries, East Africa through Southwest Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, and so on. So those are patterns where I think those countries are in a situation where, because they're economically underdeveloped, they're very much price takers. They're not able to afford the kind of desalination or even just some of the rudimentary techniques that are very available in terms of making crop cultivation and agriculture more efficient in terms of less water intensive and so on. So I think we can certainly make those investments, right, in water desalination for those countries, and it's definitely one of the larger categories or a growing category of infrastructure investment. Water desalination certainly is in the United States if you look at California and so forth. So I think we're seeing that in various pockets, and it's going to be a priority. The second aspect of it would be the geopolitics. Do we think that there's going to be water wars in the Nile River, Mekong River, and other major river systems, particularly in Asia? The thing about this whole thesis about water wars is that water wars don't create more water. So what countries have fortunately pragmatically realized is that they've sort of, as much as there has been escalation and threats, they generally go back to the table and they focus on water sharing agreements so that the dam upstream hydroelectric power development that upstream countries want, hopefully doesn't have too negative an impact downstream. And yet, clearly there's already a lot of suffering. We see this particularly in the Mekong River basin, but certainly other areas as well, where there already is certainly an impact in sort of floodwaters and the impact on agriculture that upstream dam development has. But still, those countries are not choosing to escalate and to fight over this. They're just trying to figure out how to sort it out. And it's forcing a lot of these downstream investments to make agriculture, sort of adapt to that volatility. So that's generally where I see that issue going.
Parag. Tony Cordero, always enlightening and invigorating to hear you talk. So about 2 months ago, it's not really so much a question, but maybe you can comment. About 2 months ago, research firm Alpha Beta put out a fairly voluminous research report about the impact of geospatial technologies and services on kind of the GDP. I shared that with a lot of the AGS counselors. And in 2017 numbers, when they claimed that geospatial technologies and information account for about 75% of global GDP, in 2017, that's $111 trillion to the bottom line globally that kind of folks in this room are a part of. And as it relates to kind of the work you're doing, how do you, I personally think that that's even significantly undervalued, underappreciated, but just some comments if you've got any.
It's a great question. It was a very good report that Tony's referring to by this firm Alpha Beta around kind of linking global, just the broader ecosystem of GIS technologies to economic growth and productivity. And I think it's a really important nexus. And one of the things that I've tried to put some stories about in the book also is just how that digital connectivity translates into economic opportunity and productivity. So I used examples like the website Upwork. Who's heard of Upwork? There's hundreds of millions of people in the world who just work, in the digital economy without ever leaving the country they were born in, just by registering on this website Upwork, and they get digital tasks like graphic design, data analysis, whatever the case may be, and they're earning, much higher wages than what their national average is. And then there's the research that's been done just around location-based services and how it reduces commuting time, optimizing route planning, and so forth, and what savings that brings to commuters all over the world. So I think we're hopefully just at the early stages of what a powerful impact location-based services and GIS more broadly can have on the economy. And I hope that we'll see a lot more of those investments being made, because clearly it's the individual who is the primary beneficiary. And it's not even so much about, whereas in other areas there's almost a poisoned relationship between our data and how we share it. The fascinating thing about location-based services and GIS, it's all of this aggregated data that we as individuals are getting to use, and we are taking advantage of it. So it's much less hostile a relationship than what we're seeing in terms of the broader social media conversation. So I think there's a lot of wind in our sails in that industry. Everyone realizes how much they're benefiting. One of the other great things is, again, the education in this regard. I don't think this was the thrust of the question, but it's great to see the entry-level salaries, right, that are earned in this industry. So it's great to see students, and I'm encouraging students to study GIS, because it's increasingly a growth area where there's a lot of hiring and jobs. So only upside, I would say, Tony, only upside in that regard.
Yes, sir. Just want to address a few things that you mentioned. I am Carl Brown, AP Human Geography Teacher Fellow, and you mentioned how you have created books or even TED Talks and other things to enhance what you wish would have been taught in AP Human Geography or any other geography course. In the age of xenophobia, nationalism, and fascism, how can mobility truly be a human right? And what are things that we can do as teachers to enhance the learning and see both sides of the argument? Maybe perhaps immigration reform, or even new connectivity models to enhance the overall structure of who we are as people.
It's a great question. So, mobility is a human right, sort of like connectivity is a human right. I mean, these are two phrases, aspirational that we're hearing more and more. There is a whole debate, for example, around digital connectivity as a human right. Should it be classified as such? It's actually being discussed in diplomatic fora, and technology companies are weighing in on it. And there's all sorts of arguments that are being made. It's easier to phrase connectivity as a human right, and in some ways it's happening anyway, in the sense if you look at the near universality of mobile phone penetration, it's as if that specific type of connectivity is becoming a sort of natural human state of affairs, irrespective of whether or not we ever agree on whether it's a right or not. Mobility, unfortunately, is different in the sense that this is the very function of borders among them, among others, but historically has of course been to control migration in and out. This is one of the areas of sovereignty that actually still is sovereign. You've even found that sovereignty or international cooperation within the European Union, for example, which had legislated already free movement of people, this is now being country by country revisited in order to control migration. So I don't foresee anytime soon or ever us having a universal agreement, right, around the mobility, free mobility of people across borders. Even though it's the kind of thing that enjoys a consensus among a lot of people from the left and the right, if you will, right? It's very often libertarian economists, right, who say we should actually open all borders because then we'll actually optimize economic space. You will be able to, part of their argument is you could almost defund international aid and international aid agencies because the volume of remittances would grow so staggeringly that it would easily dwarf and substitute for government expenditure on international aid. So you see people who believe in just from the rights approach and from the economic approach actually converge on this idea that we should just have free movement of peoples. But it's the one thing that will never happen because it's in an age where governments are ceding so much sovereignty around control of their economies, their monetary policy, and so many other areas. This is the one thing left for them to control, and of course, because also, as you mentioned in your question, it's so deeply visceral and political, right? It's about identity. But what I find so ironic is that, especially in Europe, in the countries, in the geography, the civilization, the culture where the very idea of the nation state comes from, you see that the demographic, the ethnic dilution of those countries has become so advanced that it's actually irreversible. So sure, you see xenophobia and right-wing movements and so on, but you already have upwards of 20, in some cases 30% of the populations of these same countries being now foreign-born migrants, many of whom, because of the changes in citizenship policy that took place in the 90s in Germany and elsewhere, are now citizens as well. So how would you ever make good on the xenophobic promises that parties are making when in fact they are already you because they're already citizens of your country, So I think that it's a very backwards looking conversation, and we shouldn't, most importantly, we shouldn't pretend that just because there is xenophobia, just because there is this sort of growing a phenomenon, that it is going to sort of secularly grow, that it's going to take over our countries and our politics. It actually hasn't done any such thing. If you look case by case, you see that eventually countries modify their policies. They realize that, again, the other irony is that these same countries in Europe that are trying to, at least where the right-wing movements are trying to restrict migration, they have the worst fertility rates, right? Those are the places that most need migrants. My belief, and this is kind of the central message in the book, is that supply and demand is a far more powerful law to some degree than even our idea that an ethnically pure identity is the correct definition and composition of our political state. At the end of the day, these countries are going to have more migrants. They're going to have a lot more migrants. If anything, and this is, let me put in an early plug for Chris Tucker's new book, but as the world population starts to plateau and you have such a significant mismatch between those countries that have labor shortages and labor surpluses, there is, if anything, going to be a war for talent. Right? This is why you see these entrepreneur visas, and this is why even Asian countries, which by the way are no less xenophobic culturally than European countries are, why you see South Korea and Japan and China even now importing people. They may not be doing it as openly and transparently and sort of publicly as we think, but you'd be shocked to see the fact that even a place like Japan, even Korea, is bringing hundreds of thousands of people. In Japan, the share of the foreign worker population just crossed either 1 million or 2 million, I can't remember, for the first time. Even Japan, right? So actually everywhere in the world you're seeing, because of this mismatch, a rise in migration. So never confuse the rhetoric in politics, especially if they really are fringe parties, even Brexit. What was voter turnout in the UK for Brexit? What percentage of people actually voted for it? And then what was the demographic? It was a lot of particularly older people who may never vote again. And then you've got rapid urbanization, and in cities, of course, people tend to be more liberally minded. So I actually do see it as a blip. I'm not saying I'm not concerned, but populism, almost by definition, fails within one term. So, whichever populist parties come to power, you can, like an iron law of history, predict that they'll be voted out within the next couple of years, because these single issue parties don't exactly know how to run a country. They certainly don't know how to run an economy. So I've seen this before. I grew up partially in Germany. I can name you right-wing parties that I was sort of scared of when I was hanging out as a, Turkish-looking guy in Germany. Those parties are gone. They disappeared. They just voted in a right-wing party into the German Bundestag for the first time since World War II, literally 2 months ago. I am 100% certain, having lived in and out of that country for nearly 30 years, that party will be gone in the next 5 years, right? Because supply and demand is by far a more powerful law. And that was the point I was making at the beginning, right? What is our deepest impulse at the end of the day, right? It's not necessarily that we have to be divided from the other by that definition. And even if we felt that that was right, it still isn't going to win out when the demographics point in a completely opposite direction.
Thank you, Parag.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.